I signed a paper that said I would never talk about what I saw inside that palace. I signed it twice, actually. Once when the agency hired me and once at the staff door on the night itself, on a clipboard held by a man who never once looked at my face, just at my hands, at the pen, at the box where I put my initials. So I'm not going to tell you my real name. Call me Marnie. That's close enough, and it's what the other girls called me anyway. I want to tell you about a door. It's a small door. Green paint, chipped near the handle, tucked into the paneling at the far end of the long gallery at Kestrelmore. Most guests walk past it 100 times in an evening and never see it, because it's built to disappear, same wood, same molding, same tired gold trim as everything else on that wall. Staff use it. Waiters, mostly. It leads down 4 steps into a corridor that smells of cold stone and dish soap. Royals don't use that door. They don't know it exists. That's the thing I want you to hold on to before I tell you anything else. Because on the 21st of June, at 9 minutes past 10 in the evening, I watched Princess Rosalind of Vellana, in a floor-length gown the color of storm water, with 300 people watching her back, walk the length of that gallery, put her hand on that green door and go through it. She knew exactly where it was. She knew. And I have spent 11 years wondering what it cost her to learn. Let me back up. The Midsummer Trust Gala happens every June at Kestrelmore. It's the big one. The one where the money gets raised and the photographs get taken, and the whole kingdom pretends for one night that it's still the 1800s. Kestrelmore itself sits about 40 minutes outside the capital, up a long avenue of lime trees, and if you've never seen it, imagine a building that doesn't want you there. Gray stone, windows like eyes, a courtyard you cross feeling watched. It was a fortress before it was a palace, and it never quite got over it. I was 26 that summer, working for an events company that got contracted for the big functions, the ones where the palace's own staff weren't enough. We were the extras, the ones who carried trays and refilled ice buckets and got told, very clearly at the briefing, that if a member of the royal family addressed us directly, we were to answer briefly, politely, and then remove ourselves from the room. Remove ourselves, that was the phrase, like we were stains. The briefing was at 4 in the afternoon in a servants' hall that smelled of vinegar. 40 of us, in black, sitting on benches, while a woman named Mrs. Fairisham walked up and down and told us where the fire exits were, and which corridors we could not enter, and what would happen if our phones came out of our pockets even once. She said, "You will see things tonight." And she stopped walking. "You will see things tonight," she said again, "and you will understand that seeing is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as saying." Nobody laughed, nobody even shifted on the bench. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say to a room full of people whose job was to carry canapés. I remember it because 11 years later, I still think about it every time I hear a door close. It rained all afternoon. Proper rain, the sort that comes down gray and steady and makes the whole world smell like wet gravel and cut grass. From the kitchen windows, I watched the crews out in the courtyard, laying boards over the flooded flagstones, and the flower people running with armfuls of white roses under sheets of plastic. And then around 6, it just stopped. That's the bit people don't believe when I tell it, but it's true. The rain stopped, and the clouds pulled back like curtains, and the light came in low and gold and hit the wet stone of Kestrelmore and set the whole thing glowing. Someone in the kitchen said, "Well, the old girl's put her face on," and everyone laughed, and for about 10 minutes we all just stood at the windows with our aprons on, watching a palace turn the color of honey. By 7, there were maybe 200 people at the gates. They'd come for the arrivals. That's a whole tradition of its own, the public gathering on the far side of the railings to watch the cars come up the avenue. Families, old women with folding chairs, teenagers on their fathers' shoulders, a man selling flags from a plastic crate. Someone had brought a little dog in a knitted coat. You could hear them from inside. Not words, just that low, happy sound a crowd makes when it's waiting for something and doesn't mind waiting. And at the arch, the kestrel arch, the big stone one that leads from the outer courtyard into the inner, there was a sentry. I want to tell you about the sentry. He was young, that's the first thing. I noticed him at 6:30 when I was sent across the courtyard with a box of napkins and had to walk right past his post. Gray greatcoat, rifle at his shoulder, boots you could have read a newspaper in. And he was young, 19, maybe 20. He had one of those faces that hasn't finished deciding what it's going to be yet. Ears a bit big, a shaving nick on his jaw healing. He didn't look at me. Of course he didn't, that's the job. But here's the thing about walking past a man who is not allowed to look at you. You look at him. You look properly because you can, because he can't stop you, and there's something almost rude about it, and you do it anyway. So I looked. And he was standing so still that the rain still on his shoulders hadn't run off. It had gathered in the wool. Little beads of it, hundreds of them, catching that low gold light. Someone in the crowd beyond the railings shouted something at him. The usual, "Give us a smile, mate," and I watched, and there was nothing. Not a twitch, not a breath out of rhythm. I said quietly as I passed, because I'm not a good person, "You must be freezing." Nothing. I got about 6 steps past him, and I heard him swallow. That's all, just a swallow. The tiniest human sound in the world from a man made of stone. I laughed. I couldn't help it. I looked back and he was exactly as he had been, staring at some point in the middle distance, and I swear on everything I own that the corner of his mouth had not moved, and I still knew that he'd wanted to answer me. I found out later his name was Ainsley, Private Ainsley. He'd been in the regiment 14 months. I'm telling you about him now because of what he does later. Just hold him in your head, the young one, the rain in his coat. The long gallery is 140 feet of polished floor with tall windows down one side and dead men in gold frames down the other. That's where the reception was. Champagne and small talk under the dead men. Then dinner in the stateroom next door, then speeches, then the auction, then dancing until midnight for the ones who could stand it. My station was the north end. 2 other girls, a service table behind a screen, and a job that consisted entirely of standing very still with a tray until somebody's glass got low. You learn a lot standing still. By 8 o'clock the gallery was full. 300 people. Perfume and hair lacquer and that particular smell that money has, leather and dry cleaning, and something faintly sweet underneath. And Princess Rosalind came in at 20 past. I'd never seen her in person before. On television she always looked, I don't know, assembled, like something they built each morning. In person she was smaller than I expected, and tireder and much more real. She had a way of listening that I've never seen anyone else do. When somebody spoke to her, she turned her whole body towards them. Not just her head. Her shoulders, her feet, all of it, like the person talking to her was the only appointment in her diary. She was 29 that year, married 4 years to the king's younger son, 2 small children, one of them not yet walking. And she was, by every measure that mattered to the people at the gates, the most loved person in the kingdom. That's the part that matters. Because there was somebody in that palace who had counted the love and found her own share of it wanting. Now I need to tell you about the chair. At about 8:30, the doors to the stateroom opened for dinner, and we went in behind the guests to work the tables, and I was assigned to table 4. Table 4 had 13 places. That's not how it works. Royal seating plans are done weeks in advance by people who do nothing else. There are diagrams. There are meetings about the diagrams. Nobody sets 13 places at a royal dinner, not for superstition and not for symmetry, and certainly not by accident. But there it was, 12 chairs evenly spaced, and a 13th, wedged in between two of them at the head of the table, close enough to the princess's own place that their chair legs almost touched. No name card. I want to be very precise about this, because it's the thing I've turned over most. Every other place at every other table had a card. Thick cream stock, hand-lettered in dark brown ink, the little gold kestrel embossed at the top. This one had nothing. Just an empty chair pushed in tight with a full setting in front of it. Glasses, cutlery, a folded napkin. Someone had laid a place for a guest whose name could not be written down. I looked for Mrs. Fairasham. She was over by the service doors with a man in a morning coat. The equerry, I found out later, a lean gray fellow named Colonel Vane. And the two of them were having the sort of conversation where nobody moves their hands and nobody raises their voice, and the temperature of the room drops 8 degrees around them. He said something. She said, "That's not possible." He said something else, very short. And Mrs. Fairasham, who had spent 30 years in that palace and had a face like a closed drawer, put her hand flat on the wall beside her. Just for a second, steadying herself. Then she straightened up and walked back into the room and told the wine staff to open 6 more bottles of the Sauterne, in a voice like nothing at all had happened. The dinner went beautifully, that's the strange part. 2 hours of it. The soup, the fish, the lamb, laughter rolling down the tables in waves, a cellist playing in the corner sawing away at something gentle, entirely ignored. And nobody sat in the 13th chair. Princess Rosalind saw it. I watched her see it. It was somewhere in the middle of the soup. She reached for her water glass, and her arm passed over the empty place setting beside her, and she stopped. Half a second, maybe less. Her hand hovering above someone else's fork. Then she picked up her water and drank it and turned back to the bishop on her left and asked him something about his parish, and he lit up like a lamp, and that was that. But I was standing 8 feet behind her with a bottle of white wrapped in a napkin, and from where I stood, I could see the back of her neck. And the muscle there had gone hard as a cable. She knew who the chair was for. She'd known the moment she sat down. 9:30 speeches. The chairman of the trust spoke for 11 minutes about the water program in the eastern provinces, and he was nervous, and he shuffled his cards, and the princess laughed in exactly the right places to help him. Then she stood up to reply. And the room did that thing rooms do for her, went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with manners. 300 people leaning forward maybe 2 inches, all at once. She spoke without notes. She talked about a woman she'd met in a village called Ostmere, who walked 4 miles every morning to a well and 4 miles back with the water on her head, and had done it for 31 years, and who had told the princess, laughing, that she had never once in her life been thirsty and never once in her life been rested. The gallery was silent. "I have thought about her every day since," the princess said, "not because her life is hard, because she laughed." And then, into that silence, from somewhere out beyond the state room, came the sound of tires on wet gravel. Now, a car arriving at a palace during a gala is not a strange sound. Cars come and go all night. Staff cars, police cars, the pool car that takes the sick guest home. But this one came fast. It came up the avenue fast, and it took the courtyard turn fast, and it stopped, hard, right under the windows, close enough that I heard the handbrake. I saw 4 people at the top table turn their heads towards the glass. Colonel Vane did not turn his head. Colonel Vane was standing by the service doors, and the moment that engine cut, he closed his eyes. Just for a heartbeat, the way you do when a thing you've spent all evening praying against arrives on schedule. Then he was moving, through the doors, gone. The princess kept speaking. She didn't miss a word. She talked about the boreholes and the funding gap and the 12 villages still on the list, and her voice never once changed pitch, and I watched her hands on the back of her chair, and her knuckles were white. Out in the courtyard, and I saw this, because I'd been sent for more ice, and the ice was in the outer kitchens, and the fastest way was across the colonnade with its long windows onto the arch. Out in the courtyard, Private Ainsley was still standing at his post under the kestrel arch. He had been standing there for close to 5 hours. The car had stopped 20 feet from him, a black one, long, no flag on the bonnet, which I remember thinking was odd because everything at Kestrelmore had a flag on it that night. The driver was already out and around, opening the rear door. And here is where it gets strange, and here is where I want you to picture him, 19 years old, rein still in the wool of his coat, 5 hours on his feet. Because a sentry at that arch has a drill. When a royal car arrives, the sentry comes to attention. He presents arms. It's a whole sequence, the slam of the heel, the rifle brought up, the whole thing done in 3 crisp movements that they practice until their hands bleed. Private Ainsley did not present arms. He came to attention. I saw the heel go down. I heard it crack across the courtyard. And then he stopped. Rifle at his shoulder, chin level, frozen mid-decision, in front of 200 people at the gate and a car full of somebody who was expecting the full honors. He didn't know. That's what I understood, standing at that window with an ice bucket in my arms. He genuinely did not know whether the person getting out of that car was entitled to the salute. Because nobody had told him she was coming. Because as far as the palace, the equerry, the seating plan and the entire staff of Kestrelmore were concerned, she was not coming. Somewhere in a duty office there was a list of expected arrivals, and her name was not on it, and a 19-year-old boy was standing under a stone arch in the dark with a rifle, doing arithmetic that grown men with pensions had spent the last 2 hours refusing to do. Colonel Vane came out of the door at a near run. I saw him cross the courtyard. I saw him reach the car. I saw him bow. And I saw Private Ainsley, a half-second behind him, a half-second too late, that half-second which in the regiment is the difference between a soldier and a story, bring his rifle up and present arms. Perfect form, beautiful actually. You could have hung that salute in a gallery. Just late. And the woman who stepped out of the car looked at him for slightly longer than she needed to. She was 58. Silver blonde, coiled up, emeralds, a coat over her gown held closed at the throat with one gloved hand. Queen Marguerite, the king's second wife, stepmother to the princess's husband. Not invited, not expected, not on any list. But there was a chair. Somebody had laid her a place, without a name card, without telling the equerry, without telling the princess. Somebody in that palace had known she was coming and had made room for her in silence. She stood in the courtyard for a moment, and she looked up at the lit windows of the state room, where 300 people were listening to Rosalind of Velener talk about a woman in Osmere who laughed. Then she said something to Colonel Vane. He didn't answer. He gestured towards the door. That small, awful gesture, this way, ma'am, that a man makes when he has been overruled by a force he cannot name. And Queen Marguerite walked past Private Ainsley, still frozen at present arms, and did not look at him again. I ran. I'm not proud of it. I ran across the colonnade with an ice bucket sloshing in my arms, and I came in through the service door of the state room, and I got to my station just as the applause was ending. The princess had finished her speech. She was still standing. 300 people were on their feet for her, clapping, and the noise was enormous, and she was smiling that smile that goes as far as the cheekbones and no further. And the great doors at the south end of the stateroom opened. The clapping went on for perhaps 4 more seconds. Then it fell apart, not all at once in patches like the tail of a wave. The people at the back saw first and stopped, then the middle, then the front tables turning one by one in their gold chairs. Until it was silent, and 300 people were on their feet in total silence, facing a woman in a green coat standing under the doorway of a room. she had not been invited into. Queen Marguerite let the silence run. I've thought about this for 11 years. She could have moved. She could have crossed the floor, kissed the princess, sat down, made a joke, and it would have been a footnote. A funny story. Do you remember when Marguerite came late to the midsummer? She let it run. 4 seconds, 5, 6. Long enough for every single person in that room to understand that they were witnessing something. And then she unfastened her coat at the throat and let it slide from her shoulders into the hands of a footman who had appeared from nowhere, and she started to walk. Towards the top table. Towards the empty 13th chair. And I looked at Princess Rosalind, still standing, still smiling, in a gown the color of storm water. She did not look at Queen Marguerite. She looked, very briefly, over the heads of every guest in that room. Down the length of the state room, through the open doors, along 140 feet of polished floor, to the far north end of the long gallery, to a small green door with chipped paint tucked into the paneling. And I watched her measure the distance. There's a thing that happens to a room when nobody knows what to do. It gets loud. Not with talking, with everything else. You start hearing the cellist's chair creak, the hum in the chandeliers, a woman at table 9 setting down a glass and the little talk of it going off like a gunshot. 300 people standing up, and I could hear somebody's watch. Queen Marguerite crossed the floor. She wasn't quick about it. She had the walk of a woman who has never in her life had to catch anything, no bus, no lift, no husband, green silk, emeralds at the ear. And she came up the length of that state room with her chin very slightly lifted, the way you do when you want to be photographed and there are no photographers. At table 4, 13 people stood and waited. And Princess Rosalind, who had not sat down since her speech, who had 300 people's applause still hanging in the air around her like smoke, turned, at last, to face her. She smiled. I want to be fair here. 11 years on, I've heard 100 versions of that night from people who weren't in the room, and in most of them Rosalind is either a saint or she's ice. She was neither. She was a 29-year-old woman who'd been on her feet since 7 in the morning and had 2 small children asleep 40 minutes down the road, and someone had just walked into her evening and taken it away from her in front of everyone she'd ever have to work with again. She smiled and she did the small curtsy, the dip, correct to the inch. And Queen Marguerite put a hand on her forearm and kissed the air beside her cheek, and said, warmly, clearly, in a voice pitched for a room, "Darling, you must be exhausted." I was 8 feet away, with a bottle of Sauterne in a napkin. I heard it. The bishop on the princess's left heard it, because I watched his eyebrows go somewhere near his hairline and come back down again, carefully, like a man lowering something breakable. And I want you to understand what that sentence was. Because if you write it down, it looks like kindness. You must be exhausted. It looks like a woman noticing another woman is tired. If you'd read it in the paper the next morning, you'd have thought, oh, how nice. But she said it after the speech. She said it to a woman who had just held 300 people in the palm of her hand and made them go quiet about a well in Osmere. You must be exhausted, meaning you've been trying so hard, meaning everyone can see the effort, meaning sit down, dear, you've done your little turn. And she said it in a voice that carried to table 6. The princess said, not at all. 2 words, perfectly pleasant, and then she pulled out the 13th chair herself. With her own hands, in front of everyone. She pulled out that chair and stood holding the back of it, waiting like a footman, and there was a beat, 1 beat, and it was the longest beat of that whole night, where Queen Marguerite had to either sit in it or explain why she wouldn't. She sat, and Rosalind pushed the chair in behind her, gently, and everybody in that room understood that the Princess of Velaner had just seated her stepmother-in-law like staff. Somebody at table 11 laughed, once, instantly strangled. Colonel Vane, over by the doors, put 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. The dessert came out. That's the bit nobody believes. There was a whole dessert course. 300 people sat down and ate poached pear with almond cream, while at the top table 2 women had the quietest conversation I have ever been unable to hear. I was refilling water. I made that job last 4 minutes. I have never in my life poured water so slowly. Fragments, that's all I got. Fragments over the cellist and the clink of spoons. Marguerite, only that people notice, that's all. They notice and they talk, and I'd hate for you to be. Rosalind, not looking up, then let them talk. Marguerite, laughing delightedly at nothing. Oh, you are young. And then, later, and this is the one I'm sure of, because she leaned in and the leaning made her voice drop and dropping made it clearer. He'll tire of it, you know, the sincerity, they always do. The princess put down her spoon. She put it down without a sound, which is harder than you'd think on that china, and she folded her napkin twice and laid it beside her plate. And she said something back. I didn't hear it. I have spent 11 years not hearing it. I was 3 feet too far, and the cellist chose that exact moment to go into something with a lot of low string in it. And whatever Rosalind of Velener said to Queen Marguerite in that stateroom is gone, and it's gone forever, and I'll go to my grave wanting it. But I saw Marguerite's face. Something went out of it, like a light behind a shutter. For about a second and a half, a 58-year-old woman in emeralds looked at the table. Then she picked up her wine and turned to the ambassador on her right and asked him about his tennis, and her voice was silver all the way through. The princess stood. Nobody expected it. You don't stand between courses. There's a whole architecture to these nights, and standing isn't in it. She stood and pushed her own chair back, and 13 men and women scrambled up around her because you can't stay seated when she's standing. And then the table behind that one went up, and the one behind that, and it went through the room like something spilling. 300 people, on their feet again, for the second time in 20 minutes. She said, please, please sit. Sit down, all of you. She was smiling. Her voice was completely steady. I want that on the record. Completely steady, warm, a little amused, and she said something about the pears and about the chairman's speech, and everyone laughed, and she thanked them for coming, and she asked them so nicely, to enjoy the rest of the evening. And then she started walking. Not towards the private doors behind the top table, which is where she was supposed to go. Not out through the south end where the cars were. She walked into the room. Down the center, between the tables, through her own guests. Have you ever watched 300 people try to work out whether something is happening? They didn't know whether to sit. She told them to sit, but she was walking past them, and you can't be sitting when she goes by, so they stood again as she passed and then didn't know whether to sit down after, so mostly they just stayed up, and by the time she was halfway down the stateroom, the entire dinner was standing in silence watching her back. She passed table 9, table 6. She stopped once, I saw this. She stopped at table 3 and bent down and said something to an elderly woman in a wheelchair, and the woman took her hand and held it, and Rosalind laughed at whatever she said back. A real laugh, head tipped. Then she straightened up and went on. Through the great doors. Into the long gallery. And every single person in that stateroom was now looking at an empty doorway with no idea whether to follow. I got there first because I was staff, and staff don't go through the middle of a room. We go around. I came in through the service arch at the north end of the gallery with an empty tray in my hands and no earthly reason to be there, and I stopped dead behind the screen. 140 feet of polished floor. The dead men in their gold frames down one wall. The tall windows down the other, black now, with the courtyard lights on the glass. And the princess walking towards me. Alone. I'd never once seen her alone. In 4 years of that woman being on every front page in the kingdom, I don't think anyone had. There was always someone. The husband, the lady-in-waiting, the protection officer, the child on the hip. She came down that gallery on her own with her heels going tap, tap, tap on the parquet, and the sound went up into the vaulting and came back down doubled. She wasn't smiling anymore. She wasn't crying either. I want to say that too because it's the version people want and it isn't true. There were no tears. Her face had simply stopped. All the machinery of it, all the listening and the warmth and the turning her whole body towards you, all of it switched off. What was left underneath was so tired that I had to look away. 8 feet from the green door she saw me. I dropped into a curtsy so badly I nearly went over, and I heard her stop. And she said, "Is there a passage?" I looked up. She said it again, and her voice was ordinary, the way you'd ask anyone anything. "Is there a passage? Behind that door? Does it come out at the east courtyard?" I said, "Yes, ma'am. 4 steps down, then left, then it's kitchens, ma'am, it's not." "Left," she said. "Ma'am, they're stock crates, it's not." "Left," she said again, and then, "And I have never forgotten this," she said, "thank you." To me. Then she put her hand on the green door, and I saw her hand shaking, and she went through it. Behind her, at the far end of the gallery, the guests had started to come out of the state room. Not many, 20, 30, standing in the doorway in their dresses and their black tie, looking down 140 feet of empty polished floor at a door swinging shut on its hinges. Colonel Vane came through them like a man wadding. He got about halfway down the gallery and stopped and stood and looked at the green door. He didn't go after her. I've thought about that. I think he understood something in that moment that took me another decade. I think he understood that a woman who walks out of a state dinner through the servant's door is not running away from anything. She is walking, in front of witnesses, on the shortest possible line, to somewhere she has decided to be. And that the worst thing you could possibly do to her at that moment was catch up. Now, the east courtyard door comes out under the colonnade, about 40 feet from the Kestrel Arch. And under the Kestrel Arch, at 11 minutes past 10 at night, Private Ainsley was still standing. 19 years old, 6 hours on his feet, rain long since dried out of the wool of his greatcoat. 90 minutes earlier he'd been half a second late presenting arms to a woman nobody had told him was coming, and I don't know what that had done to his insides, but I know what it does to a young soldier, because I married one eventually and he told me. It eats you. You stand there and you do it again in your head 300 times, and every time you're faster, and every time it's still too late. Beyond the railings, the crowd was thinner, but it hadn't gone. That's the thing about people at gates. They wait for the going home almost as much as the arriving. Maybe 80 of them left. The man with the flags had packed his crate. The little dog in the knitted coat was asleep on somebody's lap. And the east door opened. And the Princess of Velliner came out into the courtyard in a storm-colored gown, alone, with no coat, and stopped. I saw it from the colonnade window. I'd run again. I'd run through the back corridors with an empty tray still in my hands like an idiot, and I got to the glass and pressed against it just as she came out. She didn't know where to go. That's what got me. That's the image I've carried. She'd been so certain about the door, so certain about left, and then she came out into the open air and she just stopped in the middle of that wet courtyard and stood there with her arms at her sides. 20 feet of dark flagstones between her and the arch. Behind her, the palace, lit up like a ship, full of 300 people. And she had nowhere she was allowed to go. The crowd saw her. I heard it, that ripple. Somebody said her name, then somebody else, not shouting, almost hushed. 80 people at a railing at 10 at night, suddenly all standing up at once. And she flinched. She turned her head towards them and I watched her flinch, and she put a hand up near her collarbone, the way you do, and I thought, she's going to run. She's going to run back inside and it'll be in every paper by morning. And then Private Ainsley moved. Here's what he did. I want to be exact, because the versions that went around afterwards got it wrong in every direction. Some people said he saluted her. Some said he spoke to her. There's a version where he took off his greatcoat and put it round her shoulders, which is nonsense, and would have got him thrown out of the regiment inside a week. He didn't do any of that. He took 2 paces to his left. That's all, 2 paces. And he came to attention there, and he faced out, not at her, never at her, out towards the crowd at the railings. And it took me a second to understand. He'd stepped in front of her. Not blocking her. He wasn't hiding her. You can't hide a woman in a courtyard behind one man. He just moved himself to a place where the line between 80 pairs of eyes and the Princess of Vellenor went through him first. 6 hours on his feet, a botched salute burning a hole in him, and a 19-year-old boy did the arithmetic in about a second and a half and worked out that the thing this woman needed, at 11 minutes past 10 on the worst night of her life, was for somebody to stand between her and being looked at. And then he did the second thing. He brought his heels together, and he presented arms. To her. Full drill, the slam, the rifle up. 3 movements, crisp as glass, ringing off the stone of that arch so loud that people at the far railing jumped. Nobody had ordered it. There was no royal car. There was no protocol on earth that called for a sentry to present arms to a woman standing in a wet courtyard in a torn hem. He did it anyway. 6 hours late and 100 years too formal, a boy in a gray coat gave a princess the salute that the whole building had failed to give her all night. And he held it. She looked at him. She stood in that courtyard and she looked at the back of a 19-year-old soldier holding a salute for her in the dark, and I watched her face come apart and put itself back together, all in about 4 seconds, and neither of those things showed from the railings, because he was in the way. That was the point. Then Princess Rosalind of Vellenor walked forward and stopped beside him, close enough to touch and not touching. And she turned around. She turned to face the crowd. 80 people, her hair coming down on one side. No coat, no smile, she didn't try for one, and God, I loved her for that. And she lifted her hand, and she waved at them. Small, almost nothing, the way you wave at someone across a road. And the crowd went up like a wave hitting a wall. Not cheering. That's not the word. It was something rougher than cheering, 80 people at a railing making a noise I've never heard before or since, and somebody was shouting, "We love you," and somebody was crying, and the little dog was barking its head off in its knitted coat, and hands were coming through the bars. She stood there and she took it. For maybe 15 seconds she stood in that courtyard, ruined, with her arms at her sides, and let 80 strangers love her. Then she said something to Private Ainsley. I couldn't hear it. Nobody could. She turned her head about 6 inches towards him and said maybe 5 words, and he did not move because he was at present arms, and a man at present arms does not move. But she waited. She stood there and waited, and she must have known he couldn't answer, and she waited anyway. And after a moment he said something back. Just one thing, I saw his jaw move. Then the cars came round from the north yard with their lights on, and Colonel Vane came out of the east door at last with a coat over his arm, and it was over. She went home to her children. There was nothing in the papers. Nothing that mattered, anyway. One gossip column ran 3 lines about the princess leaving the midsummer early, understood to be unwell, and everybody in that building let it stand. Queen Marguerite stayed until midnight. She danced twice. She was, by all accounts, absolutely charming. 6 weeks later, she gave up 2 of her patronages, citing her health, and never sat at a Kestrel Moor top table again. I don't know what was said between them. Nobody does. Whatever Rosalind of Vellenor said over the poached pears with the cellist covering her, she said once, quietly, to one person, and neither of them ever repeated it. That's the part I find frightening, actually. Not the walk, not the door. The fact that she never told anyone what she'd said. Private Ainsley was on a charge by Monday morning. The half-second at the car. Somebody had noticed. Somebody always notices. He was written up for a late salute to a member of the royal family, and he stood in front of a warrant officer and said, "I'm told," that he had no excuse, which is the only answer there is. 3 days after that, the charge was withdrawn. No reason was given. Nobody signed anything. His sergeant told him it had gone away and told him not to ask, and that was the end of it. He served 11 years. He's a driving instructor now up in the north, and he has 3 daughters, and I know all this because I found him. Of course I found him. It took me 2 years. I asked him what she said to him, in the courtyard. He was quiet for a long time. We were standing in his front garden and it was starting to rain, and he didn't seem to notice. He said she'd asked him how long he'd been standing there. And that he'd said, "All evening, ma'am." And that she'd said. He stopped, he looked at his hands. She said, "So have I." I signed a paper that said I would never talk about what I saw inside that palace. And I've kept it mostly. I've never given a name, never taken a penny, never sat down with anybody's newspaper. But there's a small green door at the north end of the long gallery at Kestrelmore, with the paint chipped near the handle, and every year at midsummer I think about a woman who had every gilded exit in that building available to her, and chose the one the servants use. People say she walked out that night. She didn't walk out. She walked through her own guests, through the servants' passage, through the wet dark of that courtyard, and out the far side into the arms of 80 ordinary people at a railing who had waited 4 hours in the rain just to see her go home. That's the thing nobody in that stateroom understood, chewing their pears in the silence. They thought the room was the whole world. But the room was 300 people. And outside, past the arch, passed a boy in a gray coat holding a salute nobody ordered him to give. Outside, there were the rest of us. There always were.